Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. This is a review video about political philosophers for students who were absent from class for whatever reason. Here we go. Giddy up for the learning. Here are some of the things we'll be covering. We'll be looking at people like Machiavelli and Hobbes and John Locke, Montesquieu, Voltaire, Rousseau, Karl Marx, Adam Smith, and Edmund Burke, and several of their ideas. Niccolo Machiavelli. Leaders should be strong like lions and clever like foxes. It is better for leaders to be feared than loved. His most famous work was The Prince. Machiavelli was imprisoned, tortured, and sent into exile. He believes necessity is and was more important than good. He believes a leader should lie and betray to maintain power. Machiavelli redefines the word virtue. Well, it's an Italian word, which is similar to the English word virtue, but it means something in Italian that's different than English. Something like manliness. And what he means by this is a courageous, rapid decisiveness to take action. The action that's needed. His name has become an adjective. For example, Machiavellian dystopia. How should leaders behave? What was the most important thing for leaders? The most important thing is to stay in power, and they should behave in the ways they need to stay in power, which may include lying and betraying, but not to so much of a point. There's a limit where they become hated. The example Machiavelli gave of virtue was an example where Borgia tricked leaders to coming to talk with him and had them killed. Machiavelli believed it was more important to be feared than loved. Not loved, feared. And the animals that he thought we should learn from were the fox and the lion. We need to be clever and shrewd like a fox, and strong, swift, and powerful like a lion. He thought if people fear you, they will be too scared to betray you. He thought humans were unreliable, greedy, and dishonest. Machiavelli saw himself as a realist, seeing the real nature of reality, and that people need to work as leaders and politicians in the real nature of reality in order to continue to achieve power. So he had a low or bad view of human nature, and he thought humans were fundamentally selfish, greedy, and dishonest. Yo, Mr. T-Dog is in the house today to teach you about Thomas Hobbes. Here we go. All right, Thomas Hobbes. He wanted a strong and powerful leader to keep you safe and secure. This is for your benefit, for your safety and security, to keep society to be safe and secure. But he believed that human nature was prone to being bad. Born to be bad. All right. He described the state of nature without a government as a war of all against all. He added some details that he described this life as 1, solitary, 2, poor, 3, nasty, 4, brutish, and 5, short. The purpose of government was to protect people from themselves with strong authority. He believed that the social contract with the monarch was binding. There was no right to revolt or resist the power of the monarch. He believed that the monarch should have absolute authority and be strong and scary like a sea monster called a Leviathan. He named his book after this sea monster. Hobbes is a really important person in history to learn from because he gave an argument for why strong authority is perhaps needed. And also, this pattern has reoccurred many times throughout history. In medieval times in Europe in the form of feudalism. And there was also a form of a feudal government in Japan, something like feudalism. But perhaps some of these patterns could be reoccurring in the 21st century. So we need to understand the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes and feudalism to understand patterns that we would like to see happen and like to avoid for the 21st century in the areas of government and power. The solution for crime was to have one strong person in charge of government with incredible power, where people would enter a social contract to give up freedoms to gain safety and security. The metaphor of the Leviathan refers to a gigantic sea monster, and for Thomas Hobbes, the monster was a reference to the powerful state, the powerful monarch, the head of the state. John Locke wanted a little more from government than just safety and security. He wanted the right to life, liberty, and property. Liberty. And so he didn't want to give up liberty to government. The end of law is not to abolish or restrain, but to preserve and enlarge freedom. He agrees that the Constitution should exist and limit the powers of the monarch, so he would agree with constitutional monarchy. He agrees with the idea of a social contract, but he also believes that the social contract is a breakable contract. He believes that the purpose of government is to protect our natural rights, and if the government fails in that purpose, then the government has broken the social contract, and therefore the people have the right to revolt. John Locke also championed religious toleration. He thought it was absurd to force people to change their religious beliefs through torture. His view was that we have a God-given right to life, freedom, happiness, and property. And it influenced many other countries, including the United States of America. So, because John Locke also believed in both freedom and property rights, this influenced his thinking and philosophers after him to really promote and include property rights. But so this idea eventually became known as classical liberalism. Liberalism or classical liberalism. And in contrast, modern liberalism tends to focus on liberty and equality and human rights, where classical liberalism is what John Locke is saying here, liberty and property rights. So one of the debatable issues is about freedom. How can you be free if you are so poor that you have no property and can't afford to do the things you want to be free to do? The fact that you do not own property limits your freedom, where people who have more property, more wealth, more power, have perhaps more freedom. And this would get into the issue of equality. But notice, equality is not one of the issues that John Locke is talking about. John Locke also thought about this idea that the human person, the human being, is a different person in time from when they're a child, a young adult, an older adult, and then an elderly adult. They change over time, and that a person is what they remember, and if they have committed a crime that they no longer remember, they are no longer guilty of the crime that they have forgotten about, which could have implications in legal law. However, some people argue about this debatable issue. Generally speaking, John Locke was on the side of philosophical empiricism, where he thought our experiences was the primary way of understanding reality. He argued that there was a real reality and that was separate from our perceptions. For example, if you look at the issue of color, people may perceive color differently, and the actual objects in the real world may not actually have the color that we perceive them to be. So that would be an example. For example, if a colored light shines on an object, it could change light. If the lighting changes, the light of an object or the look of an object can change. And so he's thinking some things in the real world are fixed, which he calls their primary qualities, and secondary qualities like color that can change depending on lighting, and perception are secondary. Back to classical liberalism. Take a photograph of this slide if you are confused about classical liberalism. Social contract theory suggests that people and the government enter into a contract with both sides having rights and responsibilities. Some philosophers of this contract can give people the right to revolution. John Locke is on that side. If the government does not do its job to protect people's right to life, liberty, and property, then the people have a right to break the contract. Now, of course, democracy is the way that democratic countries do change government. The purpose of government for John Locke is to protect your rights to life, liberty, and property. Take a photograph of this slide if you are interested in reading more about John Locke's ideas of secondary and primary qualities of the world and how perceptions and empirical evidence can be changed by perceptions. So with philosophical empiricism, where your experience is the primary way of perceiving and understanding the world, there are different ways of considering that. Is like how much evidence is needed. Is it individual perceptions? Is it scientific perceptions that are observed in the scientific method? Montesquieu believed that we should separate government into branches of government: the executive branch, the judicial branch, and the legislative branch, in order to, one, prevent tyranny and dictatorship, and two, to spread out the decision making and get better decisions among multiple minds of human beings. And the reason why he thought this would work is that he believed something fundamental about human nature through empirical observations of history. He believed that people were jealous and envious by nature, and this would work to have the branches compete with ambition to hold each other into account. He believed that we needed to look empirically at how government has functioned in the past and use those observations to create a better government for the future. And this is why he thought, we have seen lots of tyrannies in the past, all the power going into one human being. In order to prevent that, we need branches of government that are very separate to prevent this problem of all the power going to one human being and all the power becoming tyrannical. Here's a quote from James Madison: "Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government." Now, a lot of these philosophers from the past use the word man to mean human or people or human beings or humankind. Here is a diagram of the branches of government. Take a look at this and take a photograph if you need to. Pause the slide. Okay, I'm going to try and go through Voltaire really fast and really simplified. All right, so he believed in some ideas of legal justice and some ideas of rights. And for his time period, he was perhaps quite progressive compared to his contemporaries, so much so that he was arrested and put in prison for 11 months. However, there are some modern criticisms of Voltaire, but he was advocating for things like freedom of speech and legal rights. He also supported religious tolerance, and because he was put in prison for what he wrote, he definitely was very passionate about freedom of speech. He spoke out frankly against the religious establishment. He criticized religious intolerance and clerical corruption. He spoke out against political establishment. He criticized tyranny, arbitrary power, social inequity, and legal injustice. He conflicted with Rousseau on many topics. He did not like the Romantic movement or the idea that our childlike state is the most pure. He also criticized superstition because he was an advocate of reason. On the topic of freedom of speech, I hate what you say, but I will defend to death your right to say it. Voltaire, quoted by Warburton Nigel on page 94 of our textbook. His free speech was impacted by censorship and arrest. Many of Voltaire's works were censored and or burned, and he spent about 11 months in the Bastille prison in the city of Paris, in the country of France. Voltaire wrote an incredible book called Candide. Now, he wrote this under a pen name to avoid censorship issues. It was still very controversial. He criticized philosophical optimism. The idea is that all is for the best in response to human suffering and natural disasters. Take a photograph of this slide. Voltaire left his name off the title page of the novel Candide in order to avoid getting arrested and avoid the book getting banned immediately. Okay, so in the book Candide, we can compare and contrast the character of Pangloss and the character of Candide, which is more in line with Voltaire's own opinions. So Pangloss, pain and suffering is needed for growth and future happiness. And this character Pangloss is echoing the ideas that many philosophers had. So Voltaire, through this book, is criticizing other philosophers. Voltaire's character Candide wants practical solutions to life problems, to focus on their own business rather than worry about the world. And we need to work hard on a project, and we need to have a good night's sleep. And the earth in the garden is a metaphor for being practical and down to earth. So the famous quote is, "We need to tend our own garden." Also, some modern sources criticize Voltaire. So this is a complex topic. In some cases, he was a great and leading advocate of human rights, and at some times he criticized slavery. However, he did not stay always consistent. And so there are some problems when you examine his philosophy. There were also many problems with many of the philosophers. For example, Jean-Jacques Rousseau had a lot of problems in how he wrote about women. All right, here we get to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He believed that human nature and the state of nature was naturally good, and the civilization is the corrupting force. He wrote a book called The Social Contract. He was a romantic, which means he has a sense of hope over reason, compared to his contemporaries, which were more empirical. And on this issue, Voltaire disagreed very much. Rousseau argued that religion is a matter of the heart and did not like religious ceremonies. He wrote, "Man," meaning people, humankind, was born free, and everywhere humanity is in chains. Jean-Jacques, quoted by Warburton Nigel in page 106 of our textbook. This is a very famous quote that gets requoted over and over again. Rousseau argued that the social contract gives people the right to revolt. However, the author Nigel Warburton does not think that Rousseau would have agreed with the extreme violence of the French Revolution. Rousseau argued that people are naturally good. Okay, so he wrote this huge amount on this topic called general will. So we're going to go through this really fast right now. Take a photograph of this slide if you are stuck on this complex concept. But basically, this concept is an inspiration from later movements, including socialism, communism, Marxism, union movements. And the idea is that there's something called the general will. And also, I suppose it's also connected to collective rights, where there's something that is collective and important and beneficial to the group, the collective, the entire community, the entire city, the entire province, the entire country, that's more important than the individual. And as an individual, you are free to obey these laws, but you must be obeying these laws because these laws are there for your benefit and your freedom. So it's a combination of if a group votes to do a certain action, then you as an individual should obey the will of the majority. Also, this is inspiration to the idea in democracy that leaders should also be listening to the will of the people, the will of the majority. Okay, that is a simplified version of this complex concept called the general will. Pause on this slide if you want to read more about the general will. Okay, now we're going on to Karl Marx and Engels. Okay, now we're getting on to the philosophy of communism and the Communist Manifesto and Marxism, which is inspired by Rousseau to some extent. Also, it also evolves out of a criticism of capitalism. So, with Rousseau, we've got some things that inspire communism, which are basically everybody's in chains all over the world, and that needs to be solved. There's not enough freedom, and there's something called the general will, the will of the group. And this is sort of an idea of the community will work to create a better community. And this idea that Rousseau starts off and then is continued into communism is sort of more about making the freedom for the group, the collective, the community, and community rights, downplaying individual rights. And so the ideas of the rights of individual property ownership becomes less, and you need to submit to the will of the community for your benefit. Okay. Marxism is a body of doctrine developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Take a photograph of this slide for some sources. And okay. Oh, here we go. Human nature is dynamic and not static, and human nature is interconnected with labor, creation, and social interaction. So basically, by nature, humans find meaning in work and creative work and social interaction, according to Marxism, as a sort of a simplification. Now, this is all really simplified Marxism. Marxism and a lot of commentary about Marxism is written at a university level. So here we're trying to break it down into simplified points, and the more we simplify it, there is room for oversimplification where it's no longer perfectly accurate, but we're going to go with simplified version. Okay, capitalism causes the alienation from labor, and basically simplified, capitalism is the problem, socialism and communism is the solution. Capitalism provides causes the alienation and removes the inherent joy of labor by forcing people to work in assembly lines and factories. A key part of communism is praxis. So there's a connection between theory and political action. So this is where it gets complex. Is this a philosophy? Is this politics? Is this economics? It's all of the above because of praxis. It's sort of, there's a connection between all these things. Okay, theory of history. Karl Marx was influenced by a philosopher, Hegel, who emphasized the importance of learning from history. History is full of structures moving towards change and towards socialism, and capitalism will naturally end. Like a flower in bloom will die as time goes on, or a tree will lose its leaves in the correct seasons. The momentum of history will cause the end of capitalism either quickly or slowly, and socialism is then the next logical step. People can help move history towards the destination of socialism and communism. So although history is moving and dynamic, people can either slow or speed up history with their actions and take action. Okay, this is the key slide to pay attention to. If you are reviewing this video to study for the test, pay the most attention to this slide. Take a photograph of this slide. This is the key things, the simple things to remember. Marxist economic and political program. Number 1, the goal of the communism and Marxism is to increase equality by eliminating classes and individual property ownership. Also, it could be considered going into class warfare. And the terms to remember are the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The proletariat is the working class, and the bourgeoisie is perhaps the capitalist class in the time of his writing. Okay. The first step is to move towards socialism and then towards communism with increasing state ownership of land and the means of production. All right, so I should also mention, in addition to bourgeoisie and proletariat, there's also a class we could call the aristocracy, but we're going to skip over that for now, that nuance between the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy in this really fast version. People should be paid according to their needs and work according to their abilities. The proletariat working class are called to rise up and take power from the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class. And if needed, if it exists, if there's an aristocracy class, they would be, also lumped into this capitalist class. Okay, in contrast to Marxism, and previous to Marxism chronologically, there is the thinker Adam Smith. So Adam Smith came up with his ideas before Karl Marx, and Karl Marx reacted negatively to the effects of capitalism. Now, there's many different ways of implementing both socialism, communism, and capitalism. So all of this, remember, there is a nuance and shades of gray with more democracy, less democracy, more human rights, less human rights. So with all these different things, there's different ways of doing it. But here we go. Adam Smith, considered the father of both modern capitalism and modern economics, advocated for laissez-faire economics, meaning free marketplace, freedom for money to move, freedom for competition without competition being stopped by monopolies or government controls. And so this freedom needs to exist for the purposes of good capitalism in this theory, without that type of problem, of the problem of either government controls and regulation or the controls of another big monopoly. Okay. Adam Smith suggested that there is an invisible hand that controls market forces, and he advocated for an early form of industrial capitalism with specialized labor. Specialized labor in this context is like you specialize if you work at a restaurant and making French fries, and all you make are the French fries. Edmund Burke. He is considered the philosophical father of conservatism, and he was writing in the context of the French Revolution, where there was a radical change happening in France. And among the revolutionaries, a particularly more radical party gained power. This group was called the Jacobins, also known as Jacobinism, and it was influencing the rapid changes in France, along with violence and many deaths. So he's reacting to things like the reign of terror in France, and the violence, and the death, and the beheadings, and saying, this type of ultra-fast change gets people upset and people die. That's not good. So he was not opposed to any changes, and on certain issues he was somewhat wanting some changes, some progress to be made, but he wanted the change to happen slowly over time while respecting all the traditional institutions, respecting the rule of law, looking to the value of the legal institutions, the government institution, and all other traditional institutions, including religious institutions. So he championed conservatism in opposition to Jacobinism in the Reflections of the Revolution in France. Okay, test yourself. Can you define capitalism? Can you define communism? Can you define socialism? Can you give an example of something that is capitalist, something or a place? Can you give an example of communism, a country that implemented communism? Can you give an example of a policy that is socialist? Okay, let's make it multiple choice. Is government ownership of hospitals, is that capitalism or socialism? Is private ownership of schools, is that capitalism or socialism? In British Columbia, a political party that was in power sold a government-owned railway to a private corporation. Does that political party lean towards capitalism, communism, or socialism? Okay, so for vocabulary, pretty much for reading newspapers or digital sources like websites, you should understand the vocabulary of the words right-wing, left-wing, right-wing, left-wing, depending on the context of how it's used. Whether it's used on environmental issues, military and warfare issues, economic issues, social, cultural, moral issues, so you understand what they're talking about. It's one of the most ambiguous terms. It's traditional history. Right-wing was people who wanted to keep the monarchy, and anyone who wanted to vote to get rid of the monarchy moved to the left of the room to show your vote, to make it clear. This comes from the French Revolution. To make sure the vote was clear, you would move to the right or left side of the room on this particular vote or this issue. Okay. Authoritarian, favoring enforcing strict obedience to authority, especially that of government, at the expense of personal freedom. No individual rights. Okay, liberalism is a confusing term because it can be mixed up with neoliberalism, classical liberalism, modern liberalism. So what is liberalism? It's a political economic doctrine that emphasizes individual autonomy, freedom, and individual rights. Now, depending on the flavor, the nuance, is it classical liberalism or is it modern liberalism? So classical liberalism is more aligned with John Locke, where it's about freedom and property rights to some extent, and freedom of people and the marketplace, where modern liberalism focuses on individual human rights as the focus of freedom and tends to lean a little bit towards progress towards improving workers' rights, perhaps sometimes at the expense of the rights of the property owners and the business owners, perhaps. But basically, with all liberalism, it's about freedom of something. Freedom is the big thing. However, what is to be free? With neoliberalism, it's the freedom of the marketplace, freedom of businesses to make money without problematic regulation, freedom of property owners to do what they want with their property, freedom of trade. So that's the focus of neoliberalism. And libertarianism is really trying to walk that line on the fence of fusing both freedom of everybody, human beings, workers, with the freedom of the wealthy, freedom of business owners, freedom of the marketplace. So say all freedoms are important in libertarianism. Some libertarians lean a little bit more to one side or the other of that fence between, is it workers' rights or the business owners' rights or freedoms? Is it the freedom of the renter or freedom of the landlord? Whose freedom is to be free? All right, laissez-faire is the belief that economies and businesses function best when there is no interference by the government. Business freedom and rights are higher than individual freedom and rights, to some extent. Now, it's all like a spectrum. There's nuances, and so there's a point where in the nuance, some people say, well, that's too much in that side or that way, and so we need to dial it back to a middle or a balance. Okay, more terms. Fascism is a very important word to be aware of, both in terms of learning about history, but also watching current events all over the world. A political philosophy that exalts nation, often race, above the individual and stands for centralized, autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader, severe economic and social regulation, and forcible suppression of opposition. Usually has a strong police force and or military. It's not about individual rights. It's about the state. And so this is where there's a similarity, I suppose, between, some people may argue, between communism and fascism, in the sense that there's less individual rights in certain forms of communism and certain forms of fascism. Are there forms of communism that respect individual rights? Are there forms of fascism that respect individual rights? You would be hard-pressed to find an example from history. Therefore, it's pretty safe to say that there's no individual rights with fascism. Conservatism. Commitment to traditional values and traditional ideas, with some opposition to change, especially rapid and or large changes. Conservatives usually believe that goodness and good solutions come from traditional institutions, and change needs to respect the wisdom learned through time, which is stored in traditional older institutions. Progressive, a group or person or idea favoring implementing social reform of new liberal/progressive ideas. That comes from dictionary.com. Progressives usually believe that goodness and good solutions come from change, not from tradition. Progressives usually want change to promote more individual human rights and more equality and more environmental awareness. So what needs to change could differ between which person or which group of progressives. Propaganda. Information, especially of biased or misleading nature, used to promote, publicize a particular political cause or point of view. Okay, earlier in the video I suggested that you test yourself to see if you can define capitalism. Here is a slide to take some notes on, especially if you were absent. What is capitalism? An economic system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than the state. More property rights. All right, so I should also mention on this topic that many countries have mixed capitalism and socialism, and also democracy can be mixed in there as well. So, for example, British Columbia and Canada have some things like healthcare that's done by government hospitals, which is socialized medicine. However, there's many parts of Canada that are in the world of capitalism and business. Okay, at the very bottom of this, you can see a slogan. Okay, for anything the government does, the private sector could do the solution better, cheaper, with more innovation. Source, somebody. That is what somebody on the side of capitalism may argue, that there's more creativity and innovation in the capitalist economy and there's better solutions. Whereas the contrast to that, on the other side, people would say, no, public ownership is better because there's less need for profit taking and more money can be paid to the workers, and the solutions are better from the public sector versus the private sector. So that is the debate. Which side can solve the problems of society? What problems? Sewage, healthcare, transportation. How do you solve these problems? Okay, pause on this slide if you need to review some debatable issues if you were absent. Pause on this slide about communism if you have been absent for any classes. Pause on this slide about communism debatable issues if you've been absent for any classes. Okay, socialism. There is democratic socialism, and there is a type of socialism that's talked about by Karl Marx. In democratic socialism, it's definitely more about democracy, and there is the fusion between government ownership and, in some cases, government social safety nets like unemployment insurance. People who argue on the side of socialism argue that this is needed for the purposes of equality, equity, and a better community with less radical wealth inequality. So often in many countries, the debate is how much socialism and how much capitalism should be mixed together. Not 100% one or 100% the other. Pause on this slide if you've been absent from class and take some notes or take a photograph. Here's a bonus term, McCarthyism. Thank you for your attention. If you found this review video helpful, consider sharing this video with a friend so they can also use this video to study. Also, if you found this video helpful, don't forget you have a choice where you can like and